It's an incredible honor for us at Eshel to host this series by a friend and a colleague and an incredible Yodea Sefer and a man with a huge heart and a searing mind, Rev Yissaschar Katz. So I'm going to introduce Rabbi Katz, but before I do, I want to do two things. First, I want to thank everyone who's helped us make this possible. The support for this and for many of our programs comes from you. And the lead sponsor of this event um, is Kenny and Jeannie Prager. Thank you so much, Kenny and Jeannie. There are sponsors that are of significance. Gloria Nussbacher and Frida Birnbaum. Thank you, Gloria and Frida. And among the group of nearly 20 or 30 supporters, you have the list here. Thank you all for your contributions. They really make a difference, and they're allowing us to share this Torah not only tonight, but to allow us to dust it off and make it available broadly for the larger community that would be interested in hearing Rabbi Katz's words. In 2016, a principal in Los Angeles wrote these words in the school newspaper of Shalhevet Academy. It may surprise many adults, he wrote, but the reconciliation of the Torah's discussion of homosexuality represents the single most formidable religious challenge for our young people today. More young people are coming out than ever before, and that repeatedly puts a face on the theological challenge. These weighty issues do not live in the abstract. They powerfully and emotionally impact genuine individuals living in our community with real life families and friends. What may seem like an interesting sociological or even halakhic debate is in truth creating crushing pain, anxiety, and general turmoil for people about whom we deeply care. It is no question in my mind that among the scholars who has borne the weight and has shed light on this question is Rabbi Yissaschar Katz. And I just want to read, this is not all of his accomplishments. We just don't have that much time, but I'm going to read this bio. Rabbi Yissaschar Katz is the chair of the Talmud department, Yeshivat Chovei Torah, and the past senior rabbi of the Prospect Heights Shul. He studied at the Satmar Brisk Yeshiva in Beit Yosef Nevardak. Receiving his smicha shortly after high school, Rabbi Katz taught Talmud and halakha at a variety of institutions. 9 years he delivered the Daf Yomi Shir twice a day in Borough Park, attended by many. During the past years, he has taught weekly Jewish thought and Talmud classes for professionals on the Upper East Side and Park Slope.
Okay, Steve, I'm going to interrupt you. It's fine. It's fine. You really don't have to. Seriously.
I want to finish.
Okay.
Okay. So Rabbi Katz has directed the Lindenbaum Center for Modern Orthodox Halacha, composed responses on vital contemporary halakhic issues, and writes extensively on matters pertaining to Jewish society for the Forward, Jerusalem Post, Hakor Rishon, and Times of Israel. In addition to all this, I want to say that, when you came to our parents' retreat a number of years ago, I still remember with tears in my eyes your expression of a certain kind of emotional solidarity, not only with the families, but with their children, with the LGBT community. And so I want to just thank you for your presence and for your kicking off this three-part series. This is the first one of three. This is about same-sex relationships. The second will be about gender and Torah. And the third one will be about the theological implications of both first two shiurim. So with that, the floor is yours. Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure. Thank you very much, Steve. Again, I'm just not going to repeat everything I said earlier because I don't want to take too much time for that. But as Steve pointed out, there are additional 20 people, and I can't begin to say how moved I am to see that, we're up to more than 90 people who took time out of their busy evenings to participate, and it's incredibly touching and moving. And I'm really truly indebted to you, Steve, and also to you, Miriam. And I guess it's not too late to say Hamakom Yenachem Otech. I was privileged to get to know your dad, Zichrono Livracha, and see him once or twice. And all I can remember is a sweet man with a sweet smile. And that's the most one can ask from a parent. So, Zichrono Livracha, Miriam.
Thank you.
And I'll plunge in right away again. And the two things I want to stress is that's important that this should be an open conversation, but also a highly sensitive conversation. People should be very, 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 very careful with the language they use. I'm going to present till roughly about 9 o'clock, and at 9 o'clock we'll open up the floor for questions. If there is a clarification question, then feel free to either raise your hand or chime in. As you know, the way it works with Zoom is I only see a quarter of you in my screen. I don't see everybody. So if it's a clarification question, if it's something that I said that wasn't clear, please feel free to interrupt. Otherwise, we'll have another half an hour afterwards to ask question and clarify. Let me say clear.
People can put their questions for clarification in the chat as well, and then you can respond that way. And
yes, I can read the chats while I'm speaking as best as I can. And let me frame what I'm trying to do tonight. I am starting with an orthodox assumption, which is that the pasuk in and of itself is non-negotiable. That's the assumption that I'm starting with, and I know that I might be a minority in this, or not everybody might agree with me. My assumption is, my starting point is that there is a pasuk that prohibits male anal sex. The question then is, what do we do with that, given that we know that there are homosexuals in the world, and God created people to be to desire people of the same sex? How can we work with that? And again, my conversation is halakhic. There is room for discussing the theology. There is room for discussing the sociology. For tonight, I want to figure out if there's a path within the halakhic system to kind of make place for people who identify as queer, and that goes to both to gay men and lesbian women, and I want to talk about both of them. But again, as a posek, I'll share the screen in a second. As a posek, what I'm interested is to figure out, is there place within the halacha to create an opportunity for people who identify as gay to live maximally satisfying lives? My answer is yes. I'm going to try to convince you of that in the next 50 minutes of that. The way I'm going to do it is in 3 parts, so that people should know what to look for, and I'll bring in the texts. I will go over the first principal texts on the issue. That's part 1. Part 2 is I will share with you what people have said and how people have tried to grapple with this issue from a halakhic perspective. And finally, I'll share with you what I think is an approach that's plausible and worth exploring. Okay? So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and go through the text. And like I said, feel free to ask any clarification questions. Otherwise, we will have time afterwards for a half an hour. So the obvious texts are the 2 psukim in Parshat Achrei and Parshat Kedoshim, which we have heard repeated, unfortunately, more times than we need, right? The first pasuk is V'zachar lo tishkav mishkevei isha. You should not be sexually with a male the way you would be with a woman. To eva hi. Mistake in a conversation about this issue is to translate it, because one of the most complex questions on this issue is how to translate the word to Eva, and I'll show it to you a little bit later. Okay, so we have this pasuk in Parshat Achrei, and then another time pasuk is repeated in Parshat Kedoshim, V'ish asher yishkav et zachar mishkevei isha, right? If a man would be with another man the way a man is with a woman, it to Eva, and then there is a punishment. Now, on the surface, this pasuk makes no sense, because a man cannot be with another man the way a man is with a woman. That's just impossible. And I should have said at the outset, I apologize if the language is a little bit too graphic. Obviously, the nature of this conversation is that it's going to be graphic. A man with a woman sexually means vaginal penetration. That's impossible. That cannot happen. So already the pasuk is kind of difficult. What does it mean that a man is with another man the way a man is with a woman? So before we go to the rabbis, I want to share with you an Ibn Ezra who quotes a Rabbeinu Hananel, who out of desperation for not being able to make sense of this pasuk says, oh, you know what this pasuk is talking about? Someone who is transgender. A male who somehow surgically altered their body and had a vagina. One of the most surprising Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel is a 10th century scholar. The Yomer Rav Hananel Zechronu Livracha. Rabbeinu Hananel says, how is it possible that a man can be with another man the way a man would be with a woman? It is possible that a person should design their body ketsuras basar isha, which seems to be referring to a transgender person, right? A person who was born male and now is female and they have a vagina, and that's what the pasuk is talking about. V'zelo yitachen b'tolada. It's impossible. Naturally, we're talking about someone who has surgically altered their bodies. That's not pshat in the pasuk. It's even not clear exactly what Rabbeinu Hananel means. Did Rabbeinu Hananel in the 10th century really know about the possibility of transgender? It's hard to believe, but the problem was so great for him. The problem was so great for him that the only way you can make sense of the pasuk talking about the man being with a woman was by saying, oh, it's talking about a person who became transgender, who transitioned from male to female. Malka,
really not happy with. So it
Right.
does seem like a little bit of a, like, I don't want to say a cop out, but like it's so.
No, not a cop out, not a cop out. But I'll come back to it. I promise I'll come back to it. Okay? Okay, fine. So going back to the question of what does it mean that a man is with another man the way he's with a woman, the rabbi's answer is, oh, it must be that anal sex is sex. Magid l'cha kasuf, the pasuk teaches us something. Sheshnei mishkavot be'isha, when we talk about being sexual with a woman, there are two possibilities. And when the Torah talks about a man being with another man the way a man would be with a woman, it is talking about one of those two possibilities. Now, I want to stress this. Of course, in the 21st century, this is blah. Yeah, of course, sex is not necessarily vaginal penetration. For the rabbis, that is a big chiddush, because biblical nomenclature is that sex means vaginal penetration. It is only the dochak of the pasuk, the difficulty of the pasuk, that forced the rabbis to introduce this new idea that no, it isn't only vaginal penetration that's considered sex, anal sex is also sex. That's why the Torah can rightfully talk about a man being with another man sexually. It's important to keep that in the back of our mind, that the first step for the rabbis to make sense of this pasuk is by inventing something against the conventional nomenclature. That's the only way it works. Okay, let's move on. Why is the Torah uncomfortable with that? So the Rishonim offer various reasons, which we all are familiar with, right? Nachmanides says, "V'tam hazachar v'habehema," pretty offensive, the analogy, but we know that to expect that of the Rishonim. Why does the Torah prohibit sex with another man or sex with an animal? Mefursam, right? It's well known, which oftentimes I like to say somewhat subversively, but if it's well known, why do you have to tell us? But okay, we all know why it's a problem. Ki davar nitav ve'einenu b'kiyum haminim ki adam ubehema lo yalidu. because sex is all about procreation, and since this does not lead to procreation, therefore, that's why the Torah prohibits it, which we all know is quite problematic. Because if that's the case, then the halacha should have been that when a woman is pregnant, the husband shouldn't be allowed to have sex with her, or the husband and the woman should not allowed to have sex. Because if sex is all about procreation, then okay, there's no procreation involved. Or when the couple is past the age of procreation, would we say that there's a prohibition of having sex? Nobody would say that. So that's quite a problematic explanation, right? Then, of course, we come to Maimonides. And for Maimonides, those who know Maimonides in general, Maimonides had an aversion to any physical pleasure. So for him, the question is not why homosexuality is prohibited. For him, the question is, why is regular sex mutter? So, and the Rambam has to struggle. Yeah, the Torah concedes some need for some sexual gratification, but therefore the Torah had to minimize it and keep it to a minimum. Miut hatashmish v'ti uvo ulhistapek mimeni bemuat shebemuat. Right? Rambam does not approach the question of what's wrong with homosexuality. Rambam's question is what's right with sex. Because the Rambam has this very ascetic notion that any physical pleasure gets in the way of intellectual pursuit. So that's Maimonides' explanation. And then finally, we have the Sefer HaChinuch, which is attributed to Rabbi Aaron HaLevi. Not clear who the author is, but it's assumed to be Rabbi Aaron HaLevi from Barcelona, who kind of, a little bit vague of what he is saying, but here is what he says. Lefi she'Hashem yizbarach chafetz b'yishov olamo asher bara. God wants to settle the world. Alachein tzviva lebal yashchitu zaram b'mishkevei hazcharim. Therefore, they shouldn't spill their seed. The language is funny. Kind of don't spill the seed by being with a male. Ki be'emet hashchata. It's considered, wasting seed. Why? Shebein b'davar to'elet pri. Right? It doesn't reproduce, but then he introduces something else. Velo mitzvat ona. Anyone want to try to suggest? I don't see any of you. So just really quickly, anybody want to suggest what is the word velo mitzvat ona? In addition to not to'elet pri, it doesn't reproduce. It also does not have mitzvat ona. Again, this is going to be hurtful, so I just want to set it up. And then he goes on and has this very negative language about homosexuality. Milvat she'inyan oto tinaf. This, disgusting behavior. Num'as u'mechi'ar hu ma'ot. It's really repulsive. Be'enai kol ba'al seichel. Anybody with a little sense would know that this is repulsive. And I just want to say that I read it A, for the full exposure, and B, that's actually going to end up being helpful for us, as surprising as it might sound. Okay, so that's the Chinuch's explanation for why the Torah prohibits homosexuality. Okay, and that brings us to the Te'eva, right? The Torah says two men shouldn't be together because it's a Te'eva. I know there is tough competition on this, but I think this is one of the funniest stories in the Gemara. It's in Nedarim 51a. Read it and look it up as many times as you can, because once you see this Gemara, nobody will ever be able to confront you with, oh, it's To'eva. Fascinating story. The Amar ben Elusha Chatnai the Rebbe, right? Rebbe's son-in-law, Hava Ashir Gadol. He was a very wealthy person, and he was once marrying off his daughter, Azbanai Lelehalila de Reb Shimon Barabi. Amar, I think I got the names wrong. It doesn't matter right now. Amalei Bar Kapara le Rebbe. So Bar Kapara tells to Rebbe, my To'eva, when the Torah says in the context of homosexuality, right? Vayikra Chav, he says, what is the word To'eva mean? Call the Amalei Rebbe the Hachanhi, any interpretation of the word Te'eva that Rebbe gave to Bar Kapara, Parchai Bar Kapara rejected it. So we're talking about multiple possible ways of translating the word, and somehow those are the incorrect ones. So if nothing else, we already know that there is multiple ways of understanding that word. So when anybody tells you, oh, to'eva is abomination, for to'eva is who knows what, no, not at all. It can be a lot of things, and we don't know what. Okay. Amalei kapara l'Rebbe. I'm sorry, Amalei parshe at. So he said, okay, fine, I got it all wrong. Can you tell me what it means? Anyway, the story is very funny. I don't have time. He makes him bring him a cup of wine from the bar, and then he makes him bring his wife and all of that and dance for him. Anyway, and he says, what does it mean? He says, Hacha Amar Rahmana. Te'eva is a conflation of three words. What does it mean? To'eh ata ba. To'eh ata ba. I'm going to repeat a word and not translate. To'eh ata ba. That's what the word to'eva means. It is a acronym made up of multiple words. To'eh ata ba. You've erred, you've mistaken. Now let me ask you a question though. Is this meant to inflate the severity of the crime, so to speak? Or is it meant to deflate the severity of the transgression? By translating to'eva, not what you thought it means. To'eva is an acronym of you are misled or you're being, sidetracked. What does it do to what the Torah says? And I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer, and because I don't know the answer, I am quite positive that it is most probably an attempt to deflate the transgressiveness rather than inflate the transgressiveness. So just important, never ever let anybody use the word te'eva to bludgeon you when it comes to this conversation, because they have no clue what it means, because even the Gemara doesn't know what it means. The Ran on this Gemara is very important. The Ran seems to think that To'eh Ataba means this pasuk is talking about a heterosexual man who goes and has an affair with another man. That's how the Ran understands this Gemara. So clearly, according to the Ran, who is a commentary on the side of the page, To'eh Ataba comes to limit this pasuk to a heterosexual man who is married. Even if we will not accept the Ran, clearly we know that the King James or the any translation got it wrong, because we don't know the translation, frankly. And the Gemara in Adoram comes to reject any attempt of taking to'eva for face value. And consequently, it can no longer be an effective tool in discussing this issue. Okay, let's continue. So, how did halacha deal with this? So, of course, we all know the starting point, or most of you know, the starting point is, of course, in Orthodox discourse, the tshuva of Rav Moshe, right? Rav Moshe thinks there is no such a thing as homosexuality. There's no such a thing, right? Rav Moshe writes, "Sheinichi davar shelo haya muvan sheyeh al zeh inyan ta'ava." It doesn't exist. The bebriat Adam be'etzem leketave mitzativo leit avot lemishkav zachar. Nobody naturally is sexually excited by a person of the same sex, and he wants to argue that that's what the Gemara that we just saw means. I don't think it's disrespect to Rav Moshe. It's just not true. I mean, how many people should I bring you, Rav Moshe, to show you that that's just not true? So, of course, there are standards on who can disagree with Rav Moshe Feinstein and who cannot disagree with Rav Moshe Feinstein. And of course, Rav Moshe was an incredibly kind, loving human being. But that doesn't mean that he understood homosexuality. It just was wrong. Just was wrong. So, but that's the standard source people use in the Orthodox discourse when it comes to the question of homosexuality. However, the last few years, people have started to move the needle and to explore other possible ways of looking at this issue. Prior to what I want to introduce to you tonight, there were 3 approaches that were suggested on how to make this Orthodox homosexuals' life possible. So the first approach is what's called ones, right? So ones is a halakhic category, which says ones, we used to have it here, ones rachmana patre. If you commit a transgression under duress, you are not culpable. Ones rachmana patre, right? Diksiv l'nara lo taseh davar, right? A woman who is unfortunately chas v'shalom raped, she is not culpable. Ones is not culpable. So the idea was that perhaps there is such a thing as emotional duress, right? If someone is born homosexual and they just emotionally cannot imagine living a full, satisfying sexual life with a person of a different sex, the only way they can be satisfied is with a person of the same sex, they're an onus, right? They're under mental and their emotional distress, and therefore they're patur. It's not a punishment. So I've been like that for many, many years. So I apologize, Sharna, but this is I really am trying my best. So anyway, one approach is onus. I don't like it, as I said, because onus assumes it's a sin, that you're not culpable. Then there's a very technical challenge to this, and I apologize again for the graphicness of this retort. The graphicness of this retort is that there's a language in the Rambam that's based in the Gemara. Nobody gets an erection unwillingly. Right? There's no such a thing as, oh, I had no choice. I had an erection. I had sex with this other person. She'ein kishui ela ladat. Maybe during the question and answer period, we can talk more about that. But essentially, for our purposes, the pushback is nobody can say, oh, I had no choice. Erection is a conscious move, and therefore, onus would not work. Number one. Approach number two is a very different angle. It comes from a very different place. This might be kind of a very well-known Gemara. The Gemara basically says, "V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et Shabbat lasot et Shabbat, Amra Torah chalel alaf Shabbat achat, k'dei sheyishmor Shabbatot harbeh." Right? The Torah says sometimes we can be mechalel Shabbos for the greater religious good of a person. Right? Be mechalel one Shabbat so that that person can then keep all Shabbatot. Here the question is like if someone got involved in some kind of accident and you need to save them, and the only way you can save them is to be mechalel Shabbos. So the answer is it's worth to be mechalel Shabbos because in exchange they will keep a lot of Shabbatot. And Rambam expands this to all Averot. Right? Rambam writes in Hilchos Mamrim, "Kishem shaharofech chotech yado or raglo shel zeh kedei kulo." Sometimes someone needs to have a foot or a hand amputated so that you stay alive. So too, we can amputate sins, so to speak. Kach bezdin morim bizman min hazmanim lavor al miktzat mitzvos. There are times when bezdin can allow people to transgress certain mitzvot for the greater good of society. So how does this argument work? So this argument works locally and communally, right? If we will not find room in the Orthodox community for the LGBTQ community, they will leave Orthodoxy. So let's look the other way for the greater good of their Orthodoxy. And also communally, we know how much weight the halakhic exclusion of the LGBTQ community has, especially on the younger generation. People feel they cannot tap into a Torah that is homophobic. So therefore, let us be, compromising on one sin for the greater good of the individual sinner and the community. That's a second approach. Again, the discomfort of this approach for me is the same as before because it doesn't solve the problem. It only says we can look away. It still calls the homosexual a sinner. and I have a problem with the Issur to begin with, I don't feel satisfied by saying, okay, yes, it is a sin, young man or young woman, but you can sin because otherwise you won't eat matzah. Otherwise you won't put on tefillin. It doesn't speak to me. It just does not speak to me. Third approach, which is even worse, but still one that's out there, is this funny Gemara. Funny Gemara. There's a beautiful story of Rav Hutner. I'll tell it to you in a minute. Some of you might know this Gemara. Amar Rabbi Leah Zaken. Rabbi Leah the elder said, Imroe Adam sheyitzra mizgaber alav. If someone sees that they have this unbearable temptation, Yelech lemakom she'ein makirin oto. Let them go to somewhere where nobody knows them. V'yilbash shchorim, they should dress in black. V'yisatev shchorim, they should wrap themselves in black. In other words, they should go in a place where nobody can see them and nobody knows them. V'yaseh ma shelibo chafetz, and do whatever you need to do. V'al yichalel shem shamayim befresya. Right? So imroe adam sheyitzra mizgaber alav. If someone says yitzra is mizgaber alav, there's this unbearable yetzer hara. The Chazal recognize there's such a scenario. Okay, just don't do it in public. So that's another approach of saying, we don't know how to solve the problem of homosexuality, but the Gemara recognizes that there are scenarios by which one would legitimately say, what can I do? And the solution is don't do it in public. Do it in private. Go to the place where nobody knows you. Obviously, this is the most hurtful solution. It doesn't solve anything. It says you're a sinner. Sorry that you can help yourself and you're going to continue to sin, but do it in private. Just parenthetically, I have to share the story of Rav Yitzchak Hutner. Rav Yitzchak Hutner was a yeshiva what was the name of the yeshiva? I'm blanking right now. Anyway, he had a good sense of humor, and he used to joke always. The Gemara says that if you have a terrible yetzer hara, go to the makom she'ein makir, go to the place where nobody knows you. Rav Chaim Berlin, thank you very much. Yes. So Rav Hutner used to say always, I actually went to that makom she'ein makirin oto, and all my friends were there. So basically, it didn't help much because all my friends were at that makom she'ein makirin oto. I love that story. Anyway, that's the state of the union. The state of the union is that within orthodoxy, within a whole orthodox assumption where we read the pasuk literally, there are three possible ways to get around it. Either it's an onus, it's duress, mental duress counts as duress. Either it is chalel Shabbat achat va'al yechalel Shabbatot harbeh. Fine, do a small aveira for your personal greater religious good and for the greater religious good of the community. Or, you know what? The Gemara recognizes sometimes we have terrible yetzer haras, we can't do anything. Just go, do it in private. At least don't do chilul Hashem. I want to offer a different approach. And in order to share my approach, I want to kind of set up a context. Set up a context which is, it only works by accepting certain methodological reads of the Bible. And the first one is reading the Bible in a radically formalistic manner. So let me explain what I mean. There is a Tosafot in Masechet Yevamot that really is the foundational block for my approach. It will be hurtful. I will set it up in the beginning. It will be hurtful, hopefully for a greater good. Here's the Tosafot Yevamos that becomes the building block for my approach. And I hope you'll be honest with me afterwards and tell me whether this is viable, this is useful, this is helpful, etc., etc. I don't want to get into the details, but the Gemara in Yevamos talks about secondary prohibitions for those with whom we cannot have sex. And there's a pasuk that tells us not only can you do X, you also cannot do Y. For all of those prohibitions, pedophilia, incest, all of those, the Gemara says, not only can't you do X, you also cannot do Y. Then the Gemara says, but what's with homosexuality? Does that additional prohibition also apply to homosexuality? Right? So the Gemara wants to know, you told me about other sexual transgressions, what the halakha is. Would the halakha be the same for homosexuality? And Tosos asks, why do you need to have a special prohibition for homosexuality? That's sex too. And what is Tosos' answer? Inami, Tosos says, here's my cursor, Mishim de Zachar ubehema Lo chashiv bia de'ein derech bia bekach. Let me show you again the language. And again, it's very hurtful language. I'm sure that this is really insulting to a lot of people, including myself, but for the greater good, hopefully it'll be worthwhile. The zachar ubehema lo chashiv bia de'ein derech bia bekach. Tosfot, along with a significant number of Rishonim, say that in Talmudic parlance, based on this Gemara, homosexuality isn't sex. Sex is heterosexual sex. Homosexuality is not sex. What's the significance of that? Here is what the significance of that, and this is really what my contribution to this conversation is. Halacha extends the prohibition of sex beyond penetration to any form of sexual intimacy. Correct? We know that when the Torah prohibits any form of sexual behavior, it's not limited to penetration. It applies to any form of sexual intimacy. How do we know that? Well, let me put in the chat the pasuk that teaches us that halakha. Right? That's the pasuk that becomes the basis for some, which says, not only don't you penetrate those that I prohibit you to be sexual with, don't get any close in any physical manner. When I said don't have sex, I didn't mean only don't have sex, I meant avoid any form of sexual pleasure. Well, in that case, thank you, Tosfot, for saying that homosexuality is not sex. Because that means that this extension does not apply to homosexuality. By Tosfot saying that homosexuality is a prohibition, it's not sex. Well, we have another pasuk that tells us, oh, the sexual prohibitions apply to non-penetrative sex. Okay, but homosexuality is not sex. Which is why my current stance as an Orthodox posek is that if someone comes to me and says, Rabbi, I'm a homosexual, does that mean that I cannot have a sexual life? I say to him two things. A, the Bible explicitly prohibits one thing. Number one. Number two, there is a significant strain within the tradition, not everybody, it's not universal, that doesn't count that as sex. I feel like throwing up. It's insulting. It's hurtful. But I'm going to hold my nose for the sake of making it possible for someone who identifies as homosexual to have a sexual life within the Orthodox context with integrity. What I mean by that is, I find it deeply disturbing when Toso says homosexuality is not sex. It is no less sex than heterosexuality. Just because that person is attracted to someone of their same sex doesn't mean that it's not sex. But that's the beauty of psak. I can give you 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, I'm not exaggerating, examples where poskim resort to a radical formality in order to mitigate, I'm going to address lesbianism as well, Steve, yeah, to mitigate the question of pain imposed by the Torah. This is my suggestion. My suggestion is that the Torah only prohibits homosexuality, penetrative sex. The extension to any form of other sexuality comes from the pasuk that I put in the chat. If indeed we accept the poskim while holding our nose that, oh, homosexuality is not sex, then there is no pasuk that extends the prohibition of intimacies beyond penetrative sex. And that becomes the very easy segue, and then I'm going to open up the questions to lesbianism. Let me bring up the text. I'll show you the Daf and Yevamos 1 second. Oh my gosh, so it's 108. Okay, I'll have to get back to you. I don't remember. It's not a half of 108. So I don't know. Okay. Anyway, so that's kind of in terms of homosexuality, and that becomes the amazing segue into lesbianism. I can't do all these sources. Unfortunately, we don't have time. Okay. One word that you need to know, you know what, let me stop sharing. When talking about lesbianism, we need to know one word. The word is mesolalot. That's the word that the Gemara uses to describe lesbianism. It's not clear even whether lesbianism is prohibited at all. It's not clear. Rambam himself contradicts himself. In one place he says it's only not the nicest thing, and in another place he says that it's asur. Mesolalot means the equivalent of penetration for women. That's what all the Meforshim say. Mesolalot means only, excuse me for the graphic formulation again, mutual genital stimulation. That is the language that Rashi and Tosfot and all the Rishonim use. When they translate mesolalot, they say the equivalent of penetrative sex for women. Let me show you a couple examples. Okay, so this is the Gemara in Shabbos Samachay is where it comes up once. Mesolalot, but the more important place is in Yevamot 66a, and the Gemara says Nashim mesolalot zo bezo. That's the description. What is mesolalot zo bezo? Rashi says derech tashmish. Right? Rashi says explicitly it's in the form of penetrative sex. Zachar unekeva, similar to the way a man and a woman would sleep with each other. What? Rashi says very explicitly, hameshafshefot nikvatan zo lezo. Mutual genital stimulation, right? Then you have it again. Meiri. The Meiri says, Ratzah lomar, I love the Meiri's formulation, shebaot zo al zo, right? They're having, so to speak, penetrative sex. The Rambam's language in Perush Mishnah once again. Yeah. V'chein oto hamaseh hameguneh hakoreh bein hanashim sheshochvot zo et zo. Nothing about, patting, nothing about fingering, excuse me for the explicitness, nothing about anything other than the equivalent of penetrative sex. And therefore, if I'm right when it comes to male sexuality, that as formalists, the prohibition is limited to penetrative sex, there is no basis to expand the prohibition beyond penetrative sex, then the same is true for women, because repeatedly the poskim say what the Gemara is talking about, the female equivalent of male to female sex. Let me jump ahead and then I'll come back to one last thing and then we'll finish. Okay. There's a bunch of other examples. This is Rabbi Rappaport that says otherwise. I disagree with him. Okay. This is a funny tshuva, and if you think that I'm Satmar, this is Satmar. This is the Satmar Dayan in Belgium, Reb Chaim Yosef David Weiss. And again, it's a very graphic tshuva, but I think it's important to share to kind of show my point. Od nish'alti mi'isha asher ba'ala paresh mimena, a woman whose husband neglects her. Uketei shetanuach data min hata'ava, in order she should have sexual satisfaction. Chaverta mefashfeshet la ba'oso makom. And excuse me again for the explicitness. Is it okay if her female friend fingers her? Imze asur. And then he goes on and he quotes all the sources that I said, and he says, look, if you look at the text, ulechaora mashma afilu b'yad ach berashi v'tosvot lo mashmi kain. Rashi and Tosfot and the Levush and everybody else seems to say explicitly that the prohibition is limited to mutual genital stimulation. And then he goes on and he says it's from Kate Sofkal Sof, it's not appropriate, they should try to avoid it, and I didn't want to be materate, which is irrelevant for our purposes. La halacha lemaisa. Reb Chaim Yosef David Weiss concludes that Rashi and Tosfot and all make it clear that we're only talking about the female equivalent of heterosexual sex. That leaves us just with one last question, which is, what is the last issue that we have not resolved yet? Meaning, if we accept my approach, penetrative sex is not negotiable, non-penetrative sex is mutar, which I believe strongly is mutar. What's left? We'll leave marriage aside, but particularly when it comes to homosexual men, what is the other issue that comes up always? Right? What's with the Zerah Levatala? With a wasting semen. So here is where it gets a little bit complicated, and let me tell you why. My simple answer to that question is the explicit text in the Chalkas Mechokek. Chalkas Mechokek is a commentator on Shulchan Aruch Even Oezer, and the Chalkas Mechokek says as follows. Let me make sure where it is. Just a second, bear with me. Oh yeah, so it's earlier. Chalkas Mechokek, commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, quotes a Sefer Chasidim. Yeah, here we go. Sorry, just a second, bear with me. Okay, here we go. Asa lahotzi shich vazera, right? You're not allowed to spill semen. Kasav chalkas mechokek b'shem sefer chasidim. Im mityarei, if a person is afraid, shall yikashel be'eshes or benida, right? If it is afraid that they're going to do greater things, then they're allowed to masturbate, right? So if the purpose is to avoid greater sins, then it's okay to masturbate, right? So the technical answer of mine would be, if you're not going to kind of allow a person any form of sexual outlet, it will lead to some greater sin, which in my perspective is penetrative sex. So of course, there's room to be matir. Here's where it's a little bit more complicated. Now, this is where I need your help. This is where I'm trying to figure out if I'm a hypocrite, and maybe I want to be a hypocrite. Let me explain to you why. There are a lot of poskim who say that spilling seed within the context of a sexual intimacy is not prohibited. For example, a man and a woman can have anal sex. Anal sex is spilling seed, right? It's zera levatala, it can impregnate a woman, and yet it's allowed. Why is it allowed? Because it's not zera levatala. It is in the context of having sexual intimacy. Here is the question: can I use that heter in the context of homosexuality, where we got to where we got only by saying it's not considered sex in halacha? Can I have it both ways? I think I can, but I'm not sure yet about that. So let me summarize what we have, and then thank you for being so patient with me, and we'll open it up the room for questions. What we have is as follows. The Torah says a man should not sleep with another man like a man sleeps with a woman. There is a very strong argument to be made that the Torah does not prohibit homosexuality. In our midst, we have one of the great scholars who has made a very compelling argument. I'm looking at you, Steve. Why this pasuk does not have to be read as prohibiting consensual gay sex. And it is an extremely compelling argument. I am trying to figure out what happens within a context where that's not ready to go there. Orthodox halakha for the moment is not ready to go there. We don't know what's going to happen in 10 years. We don't know what's going to happen in 5 years. This gallops. But for the moment, I'm talking within a context that has not yet gone to the place where it would say that consensual homosexual sex is allowed. I will buy into that system for now because I identify as Orthodox. In order to make sense of that pasuk, the rabbis had to reinterpret conventional nomenclature about sex by saying that anal sex is sex. I want you to go home tonight and know that's a chiddush. That's not pshat. So much so that the Rabbeinu Hananel could not make sense of that pasuk only by saying we're talking about a transsexual. He didn't want to say it's talking about anal sex because anal sex is not sex in rabbinic nomenclature. Okay. Now that within an Orthodox context, the Torah seems to say that homosexuality is prohibited, what do we do? Approach number one is mental duress is an excuse. For some people it works, for some people it doesn't work. Approach number two is be mechalel one Shabbos so that you can keep multiple Shabbatot, right? Do one small Aveira so that you remain Orthodox. Do one small Aveira that masses of the younger generation does not abandon Judaism because it doesn't make room for the homosexual man or woman. That's another approach. Again, you might like it, you might not like it, I don't. Third approach is, it's an Aveira. Sometimes we got to do Aveirot. Do it in private. Don't ask, don't tell. I can't think of a more offensive thing to say to a person, but that's an approach there. What I want to suggest is accept Tosafot's hyper-formalism, which based on the Gemara Yevamos says Chazal did not consider homosexuality as sex. It's an Isur. Just as you're not allowed to put out a light on Shabbos, a man cannot lie with another man, but it's not sex. If that's true, then the extension of sexuality beyond penetrative sex does not apply to homosexuality. And I'm saying this publicly. I might be beat up for that tomorrow, but listen, the good news about being beat up constantly at some point, it doesn't hurt anymore. So it doesn't matter. I really feel very confident, halacha lamaisa. And I want to make something clear. People oftentimes misconstrue what the modern Orthodox psak, how modern Orthodox psak works. Modern Orthodox psak does not look for universal acceptance. I'm not interested to find out that everybody agrees that women can have an aliyah. I believe women can get an aliyah because I believe that there are enough poskim to justify that. And because of the value interest, I am willing to rely on those poskim so that the clash is minimized. And the same is here. I'm not saying that every posek believes that secondary non-penetrative intimacies are mutar. There are enough legitimate authoritative poskim who say that, and therefore I am very comfortable to say, as long as you are staying away from that one particular thing that the Torah prohibits, and we'll talk about it in 2 weeks, not because it's bad. We don't know what's wrong with it. The word te'eva is the most enigmatic word in the Torah, according to Chazal. We don't know what it means. But somehow the Torah wanted us not to engage in that. Anything else is mutar. As far as Shechvat Zera is concerned, either we have the technical solution of, yeah, it is okay because it's in service of avoiding something far greater, or perhaps we can apply the argument of, within a sexual context, there is no Shechvat Zera. Anal sex is mutar between a couple. There is no reproduction opportunities there. So this is no different. It's not levatala. It's in the pursuit of sexual gratification, which is one of the holiest things that exists in this world. Ish ve'isha, shchina shuya beinem, the rabbis tell us. When a man and a woman are together, the third partner is God. God provides the spark. The spark, what we call sexuality, is divinity. And again, call me a cuckoo, call me a chassid. When two men found a person, or two women found a person they love, and they feel that their most intimate satisfaction would be when they can give sexual satisfaction to one another, I know I'm going to be bombarded for that. Shechina shruya beinehem. God looks down and says, Baruch Hashem, two people have solved the problem of lo tov hayot ha'adam levado. Yeshakach.
Wow.
Well, I want to entertain with, everyone's permission, rather than making it a free-for-all, which would be difficult for us to hear. Please just throw your questions, very concise, specific questions, into the chat, and I'll bring them to you. Saskar, I'm going to start with one. You and I have had this repartee since we met about, how to manage this. And I just, for the sake of clarity, it seems to me that, you're doing a different ukimta than I was doing. My ukimta was, let's retain the verse, but it applies to violent and abusive sex, or it applies to idolatrous sex, or it applies to some extension of incest, but it doesn't apply to loving, committed relational sex. Your ukimta sits more comfortably within the framework of already given halakhic frames. I was attempting to make sure that gay people felt like they had a place in God's world. But you're trying to demonstrate to the Orthodox community that gay people can and should have a place in the halakhic world. And I think it's really laudable. The claim, if you had trouble grasping it, was that instead of limiting the prohibition to other problems like idolatry or violence or humiliation, it's limiting the prohibition not to a moral failing, but to a chok like, not, having basar v'chalav. And therefore, intercourse, by the way, I'm not exactly sure why you need to do this with women, because there's no Yisur Torah with women, and it's an Yisur D'Rabbanan at best, and a derivative one at, ideally. So that I don't even think, I think like it's easier to say that women are in the category, of kavod habrius. If it's an Yisur D'Rabbanan, but for kavod habrius, if you need to be able to have love and companionship, but let's put that aside. At least for men, you're claiming that anal intercourse is the problem, at least the halakhic problem. It's not a moral problem. It's a ritual problem, and it can be solved with simply avoiding that, and that all the other prohibitions, for the reasons of the Tosfos, that doesn't expand, its sexuality is expansive in heterosexuality because it's, if you permit it here, it can expand into that. That's not that happening with this prohibition, because we don't do that with every Isur. And that is a way to sustain the possibility of celebratory relationships between men and women. And it's an incredible opportunity for us to imagine, while it might not satisfy and might be offensive even to some, what it offers to an Orthodox community is the opportunity to imagine that there's a framework by which this becomes normalized. And it's an incredible gift. Now, with that said, I'm sure lots of people have trouble. Let me see if I can grab some of the questions. Okay, this is Ariel. Do you think there's any validity? You can read it yourself.
Yeah. I mean, you want me to read it? I can read it. I mean, if you want to make it easier. Should I go in order?
No, I think start here, because it's, I think, a very specific question. Then let's see if we can find.
Right. There are a couple of questions before Ariel's as well. So Ariel's question was, do you think there's any validity to the argument of the Ran? Oh, wow. You think there's any validity to the argument of the Ran in Adarm 51a that the Rans read unto Ava can serve to limit the scope of the problem, i.e. the only prohibited act is a straight cisgender man committing adultery with another cisgender man? So this is my answer to Steve's compelling book, which is I'm trying to talk within an Orthodox framework. And when you ask validity, depends which hat you want me to wear. Do you want me to wear the intellectual hat, or do you want me to wear the Orthodox posek hat? And they're not always the same. I have to be very honest with you, right? So intellectually, am I compelled by Steve's book? I mean, who isn't? But that's not the conversation I'm trying to have, right? I'm trying to have a conversation of, as an Orthodox posek, what can I say? And the same is with the Ran, right? Clearly, the Gemara in Adarm, in my opinion, is trying to deflate the severity rather than inflate the severity. The way the Ran understands it, it means that it is limited to a cisgender man. And that's very compelling because, as Steve said, it allows me to start making sense of a prohibition that the way an Orthodox rabbi can't make sense of it. What's wrong? What's the problem? Who cares if it's people of the same sex who are sexual and people who are of different sex? And I have to end up with saying it's a divine caprice. It is just a chok. I don't know what's wrong. I don't think God is bothered by that. God doesn't want it. The Ran solves that problem. Ran says, no. God has no problem with homosexual sexuality. God has a problem with, one variation of infidelity. But then I have moved out of the Orthodox discourse, which I can do when you want to have a schmooze with me. But if you come to me as a posting and say, as an Orthodox posting, would that carry halakhic weight? The answer is, again, for the moment, it doesn't.
That's you're muted.
I have said a lot of terrible things tonight. I don't know what I said so bad now that all of a sudden you mute me. You should have muted me an hour ago. Someone said, To'eva is mentioned many times in the Torah. Can't we derive its meaning from the context which it is used? So let me say something about the Gemara in Adarm, right? The Gemara in Adarm is a funny Gemara, right? Because the Torah says To'eva about a lot of things, right? Why is the Gemara fixated on this sin and trying to reinterpret it? My guess is that we are sensing an early rabbinic discomfort with this aggressive language, particularly when it comes to this context. When someone cheats and the Torah says it's To'eva, when someone does something else, it's To'eva, they would have no problem with that because it is abominable. It is abhorrent. The reason why the Gemara tells us that there are so many different ways to read To'eva in this context is because precisely what we have seen tonight, Chazal, to one degree or the other, shared a level of jarringness This is jarring. You're talking about incest, you're talking about pedophilia, you're talking about real damaging things to society, and you put in there in the middle something that has zero consequence. And I think that's why it is, particularly in this context, that the rabbis are struggling with the word to'eva. And let me say something else. English, Hebrew language is a poor language. The English dictionary has 1,600,000 words. The Hebrew dictionary has, I don't know, 600, 700,000 words. What that means is that words would be used differently in different contexts, even though it is the same word. Every Rosh Chodesh, you say, Atzabeim v'lo yadaberu. What's Atzabeim? An idol. Atzabeim is an idol? Well, yeah, because it makes those who worships them disappointed, or because it's carved out, because that's the nature of the Hebrew language. Sometimes you'll use words and it will mean different things in different contexts. So for me, what it means in other places is different than what it means here. Here, we don't know what it means. And I wish I was at that wedding, by the way, because I would love to hear the multiple possibilities, right? Like, what are they? There are so many different ways of understanding that word, and I'm dying to hear what they can mean. But at least I dare you never to mention to'eva in the context of homosexuality again. Not you, because we have no clue what it means. Okay. Other questions? Let's see. If I understood your question correctly, there's a Yiddish expression, and I'll translate it in a second. The Yiddish expression is that when a chassid pitzach the sheich in bells, shmatzach a maskel in Berlin. If a chassid starts polishing their shoes, if a Belzer chassid starts polishing their shoes, and then in Berlin some enlightened Jew converts to Christianity. Basically the butterfly effect, right? That's basically the idea that, we're all connected and we're all related. If you think that after tonight's shiur you can go to Lakewood and say, oh, I heard a shiur from this Katz guy and he thinks that any other kind of intimacy is okay, they think you're nuts. But the Sfat Emes says a beautiful idea, which I think is lovely. It says, we say in Shema every day, V'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavacha hayom al levavecha. He says, why does it say al levavecha, on your heart? It should be in your heart. He says, no. Sometimes the heart is so closed, nothing can get in. Put it there. One day it will crack open and it will get in. I think that what we're doing here is trickling into other communities, and eventually we'll get there. So, okay. So, let me summarize what Em was saying, and I appreciate that. Sounds like a Hamish critique, which is always amazing. I say oftentimes that when I write my tshuvot, half of the audience is interested in the topic and not interested in the conversation, and the other half of the audience is interested in conversation but not interested in the topic. So when someone is interested in those, that's really wonderful. So I put in the chat a link. 87 pages of sources of my argument. So if you're interested in pursuing it in depth, and I'm happy to kind of schedule a time with you to talk with you more in depth. Yeah, so take the link. It's a long, like I said, a lot of sources where I flesh it out. And if the question is what I'm saying universal, the answer is no, it's not universal. And like I said before, all I need to say is that there is a significant number of poskim that one can rely on to feel that what I am doing is not universally usher. As a modern Orthodox person, and again, I'm saying this as a modern Orthodox person, all of modern Orthodoxy is predicated on a particular philosophy of psak, which says, I don't need universal approval. There is no universal approval of women learning Torah, Gemara. There is no universal approval of women saying Kaddish. There's no universal approval of a lot of things. But frankly, I don't look for that. If I want to reconcile my value discomfort with my orthodoxy, I need to settle on yesh makom lahakol. lakel. And that's what I am arguing tonight. I'm not arguing tonight that it's universal. I'm arguing tonight that there are a significant number of poskim. And look up the sources. There's Rishonim, there's Achronim, there's Rav Elyashiv. It doesn't get more Haredi than that, who says there is no lo tikrav when it is same sex. In terms of the chinuch that you mentioned, I have it in the sources. It's fabulous. The chinuch says, why does the Torah prohibit secondary intimacies?
Let me see.
Lo tikrav, because nashim datan kalot. And if you'll agree to have secondary intimacies with your wife, it will lead to sex when you're not allowed to. To me, that means that if it's 2 men or 2 women, then it doesn't apply. So it's the sources are kind of complicated and can be used in a lot of ways. Right. So Michael is right. I mean, the Rabbi Yosef Engel, which is a 20th century Achron, is referencing Yerushalmi. The language in Yerushalmi is ansa commandalo avid. Onus is not like it's excusable transgression. It's not considered action at all, right? Because you do it under duress, it's not attributable to you. The problem is that onus does not say you can a priori deliberately pursue an act and say, oh, I'm going to do it because I'm an onus. That's my problem with that approach, right? Onus after the fact is saying, okay, if you did it under duress, then it's okay. Can you a priori go do something because of onus? That's the question of whether that applies or not. So that's the question that you're doing. The short answer to your question, I know Naama, you're waiting your hands up, so I'll go to you next. The short answer to Maseh Eretz Mitzrayim is that it's a buzzword that needs a lot of exploration. Let me explain to everybody what it means. The pasuk says, don't follow the Egyptians. And there is one midrash that says that refers to homosexuality. And Maimonides adopts that. But let's keep things in perspective. One midrash and one Maimonides. I'm like this hammer to badger the community because there is a Rambam. And again, I'm not negating the Rambam, but let's remember, it's a Rambam. We don't pass like the Rambam in a lot of things. So Maseh Eretz Mitzrayim is one, and I don't mean this Chaz Shalom as a critique of you, Michael. We haven't met yet, but I hope we can meet one day. But I know that we throw around, I mean to say in the halakhic community, Maseh Eretz Mitzrayim, Maseh Eretz Mitzrayim, Maseh Eretz Mitzrayim. It's a midrash that's adopted by the Rambam, that's rejected by everybody else. So it doesn't carry that heavy significant weight. Sure. But don't say that you got it from me. I'm just kidding, of course. In layman's terms, like I said, it's pretty simple. At this point, if a person comes to me, man or woman, and say to me, I'm gay, is there room for me? And could I have a sexual life? And my answer is absolutely, as long as you refrain from penetrative sex. That's as simple as I can put it in the simplest words possible. I feel very comfortable that halachically we can limit the prohibition to one thing, which is penetrative sex, number one. Number two, the reason why the Torah is opposed to that has nothing to do with it being bad or wrong or inappropriate or repulsive or anything else. There's nothing wrong with gay sex. There's nothing wrong with gay sexuality, but there's a lot of capricious things in the Torah. Why a red heifer can make something tahor is as capricious as it gets. And what's if the heifer is green? So God can be capricious because God transcends human categories, right? God is not meshuggah, but God is not meshuggah. God is God, and God somehow has put that there in the Torah. Fine, I'm keeping that. There is a lot of room to rely on significant, serious poskim that say you should have a full sexual life. And let me put on my chassid hat for a minute. And that life is kadosh. That life is sacred. When the Torah, I'm going to repeat myself what I said before, and it's very important that people need to hear that. When the Chazal say that God is the one who kindles the sexual fire, Ish ve'isha shchina shriya banayim. In the Zohar, the language is very graphic. The Zohar uses sexual intimacy as atzei olah, right? The wood that kindles the fire for a korban olah. That is said for gay men and women sex as much as it is said for heterosexual sex. The sexual act in and of itself, when it is done with the intention of loving another human being, and this human being loves another human being who shares the same chromosomes than them, it's no less kadosh than if you are with a person of the opposite gender. So that's in lay terms. I hope that was my elevator pitch. I hope it was successful. Thank you, Nama. I think we have room for one more question. So in the interest of time, I'm going to give a short answer, and I hope this is not come across as dismissive. And again, owning my white privilege, like again, white, Cohen, Chassid, Payas, rabbi, all of that. I know that. Is the Torah's norm heterosexual? Yes, absolutely. My short, flippant answer to you, and I mean it with the deepest way. So what? We have evolved, and we have now squeezed in homosexuality into heterosexuality, as we've done with so many other things. Judaism constantly subsumes new categories under old categories. So yeah, the biblical, nomenclature was heteronormative, not because homosexuality is inferior, because it was not in its purview. And now we have identified variation, which is now subsumed under what heteronormativity did for the Torah's language. It doesn't mean it's excluded. It was not included. I know it sounds like a chilik without a mechalik, but I feel deeply. Yes, the Torah did not include that, and now we've included it inside. So now when I hear Al Ken Yazav Ish as Aviv et Imo v'davak beishto, I say or beisho. And I don't feel that I am deviating from the pshat. I'm just kind of expanding the pshat. Okay, we need to finish. Always a good time when we need to do more, and hopefully there will be other opportunities. Yashakalach, everybody.